Red sand stretched beyond the horizon like an endless ocean of fire. The wind carried no relief, only more heat that made the air shimmer and dance. This was Zerion 7, and its desert held secrets that would either make or break the strongest beings in the galaxy. Deep underground, in a facility carved from solid rock, 12 different creatures from across known space prepared for what many considered impossible. The Galactic Survival Institute had built this place to test one simple question: who could survive when everything else failed? Dr. Melvin Reese adjusted his plain brown jacket and looked around the preparation chamber. Aliens of every shape and size filled the room. Some had thick shells that gleamed like metal. Others had long limbs that bent in ways that hurt to watch. A few glowed with their own inner light. All of them looked at the human with expressions that needed no translation. They thought he was already dead. The Krillians stood nearly 3 meters tall, their black carapaces designed to handle the worst heat any planet could offer. Their leader, Vorthok, flexed claws that could tear through steel. Next to them, the jellyfish-like Aquari floated in specialized suits filled with their home world's toxic atmosphere. The insect people called Chaitani clicked and buzzed among themselves, their compound eyes never missing a detail. Melvin had spent his 43 years on Earth doing things most people thought were crazy. He fixed oil rigs in the North Sea during winter storms. He worked construction in Death Valley during summer. He guided rescue teams through collapsed mines and burning forests. Other humans called him lucky. Melvin knew better. Luck was just another word for being ready when the world tried to kill you. A voice boomed through speakers built into the rock walls. Candidates, prepare for final briefing. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of life support systems working overtime to keep everyone breathing. A door opened with a hiss, and something walked in that made even the toughest aliens step back. Director Kravex belonged to a species that evolution had forgotten to finish. Its body shifted between solid and liquid, never quite settling on one form. When it spoke, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. You represent the finest survivors your species have to offer, Kravex said, its form rippling like disturbed water. The 36-hour desert trial above us has defeated armies. It has humbled entire civilizations. Most who enter never reach the extraction point. Holographic images filled the air above their heads. The surface of Zerion 7 looked like a nightmare, painted in shades of red and orange. Massive dunes shifted like living things. Rock formations twisted into impossible shapes. In the distance, strange trees grew from the sand, their trunks covered in thorns longer than sword blades. The rules are simple, Kravex continued. No technology beyond basic clothing, no communication devices, no assistance from your ships or governments. You will be placed 50 kilometers from the center extraction point. Reach it within 36 hours or activate your emergency beacon and forfeit your species' chance to join the Defense Corps. A Krillian named Vorthak raised one massive claw. What about the thornroot trees? Our scouts report they are dangerous. Everything on Zerion 7 is dangerous, Kravex replied. The trees, the sand, the air, the temperature changes. This desert kills in more ways than your species have names for. That is why we use it. Melvin studied the holographic images more carefully. While others saw only threats, he saw possibilities. The thornroot trees grew in specific patterns. The sand dunes had wind shadows that created natural shelters. Even the rock formations followed rules that could be understood and used. An Aquari's translator buzzed as it spoke. Surely the human cannot compete. They have no natural armor, no internal cooling systems, no enhanced metabolisms. Several other aliens made sounds that their translators labeled as agreement. A few made sounds that needed no translation. They were laughing. Melvin said nothing, Words were cheap. Results cost everything. Kravex's form solidified slightly, becoming more focused. Underestimation has ended more military campaigns than enemy action. Remember that when you are dying of thirst while watching your rivals succeed. The director's attention turned to Melvin directly. Human, your species is young. Your bodies are fragile. Your planet has barely achieved faster than light travel. Why do you believe you can succeed where others have failed? Melvin met what might have been, eyes in the shifting mass of Kravex's face. Because failure teaches better lessons than success. Earth tried to kill us for millions of years. We learned to listen. More laughter from the aliens, but Kravex made a sound like grinding stone that the translators marked as approval. Transport. Begins in 1 hour, the director announced. Use this time to prepare. Meditate. Pray to whatever gods you believe in. Make peace with your choices. The aliens dispersed into smaller groups, some meditating, others performing complex rituals. The Krillians sharpened their claws on special stones. The Aquari adjusted their suits for maximum efficiency. The Chitani synchronized their movements in elaborate dances. Melvin found a quiet corner and sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor. He did not pray or meditate in any way the aliens would recognize. Instead, he remembered. He remembered being trapped in a coal mine for 3 days with only emergency rations and dirty water. He remembered crossing the Australian outback when his vehicle broke down 40 kilometers from the nearest road. He remembered surviving a week in the Amazon after his research team's boat sank. Each memory brought the same lesson. The environment was not his enemy. It was simply indifferent. Understanding that indifference was the first step toward survival. Working with it, instead of against it, was how you lived to see another sunrise. The hour passed quickly. Transport drones hummed to life in the launch bay above. Melvin stood and stretched muscles that had carried him through disasters that would have killed softer men. Around him, the finest warriors and survivors from a dozen worlds prepared to face the ultimate test. Their confidence filled the chamber like electricity. They had evolved for this. Their entire species had been shaped by harsh worlds and unforgiving environments. Melvin had no such advantages. He was just a human who had learned that being tough meant being smart. Being smart meant paying attention. And paying attention meant seeing what others missed. The thornroot trees were not just obstacles. They were opportunities. The desert was not just a place to survive. It was a place to live if you knew how to listen to what it was trying to teach you. 43 years of hard lessons had taught Melvin Reese that the world did not care if you lived or died. But if you paid attention, really paid attention, it would show you how to do both. The transport drones were ready. The desert waited above like a furnace with teeth. It was time to begin. The transport drone released Melvin 50 meters above the desert surface and flew away without ceremony. He hit the sand rolling, came up running, and immediately stopped. The mistake that killed most people in hostile environments was panic. The second mistake was moving before you understood where you were. Heat rose from the red sand in visible waves. The sun hung in the sky like an angry eye, and there was no shade anywhere. Temperature readings would have shown 62 degrees Celsius, but Melvin did not need instruments. His skin told him everything he needed to know. This place wanted him dead, and it would use every second of the next 36 hours to make that happen. Around the desert, other landing sites erupted in activity as the alien candidates began their assault on the wasteland. The Krillians immediately activated their internal cooling systems and began power walking toward the distant extraction point. Their black shells gleamed like polished metal as they moved with mechanical precision through the burning sand. The Aquari had modified their atmospheric suits for desert conditions. They glided across the surface like ghosts, their jellyfish bodies pulsing with efficient movement. Their route was perfectly calculated, taking advantage of every slight depression in the terrain to minimize heat exposure. 3 kilometers to the east, the Chitauni moved in formation, their insect bodies sharing heat loads and navigating by instincts evolved over millions of years. They knew exactly how to survive in hostile environments because their entire species had been shaped by worlds where survival was always uncertain. Melvin did none of these things. Instead, he stood perfectly still and let his senses adjust to the new environment. The heat was intense, but not instantly fatal. The air was dry, but breathable. The sand was loose, but stable enough to walk on. Most importantly, the desert was not silent. Wind moved differently here than on Earth. It carried sounds that told stories about what lay ahead. The smell was different too, mineral-rich and sharp, but with undertones that suggested moisture existed somewhere in this hellscape. Even the light behaved strangely, bending and shifting in ways that revealed information about temperature gradients and air density. After 5 minutes of careful observation, Melvin began walking, but instead of heading directly toward the extraction point like the others, he angled northwest, toward an area that looked even more desolate and forbidding than the rest of the desert. The first casualty came within 2 hours. Grix, one of the smaller Krillians, triggered his emergency beacon when his cooling system overloaded. The desert's heat was more intense than their testing had predicted. His carapace, designed to handle the worst his homeworld could offer, became an oven that slowly cooked him from the inside. Melvin heard the rescue shuttle's engines through the hot air and adjusted his course slightly. Emergency extractions created updrafts that affected local wind patterns. Small changes. But in a desert, small changes could mean the difference between life and death. By midday, 3 more aliens had activated their beacons. The Aquari discovered that their suits, perfect for gliding across smooth surfaces, became energy traps when forced to navigate loose sand. 2 of them collapsed from heat exhaustion within minutes of each other. The Chitauni lost one of their formation when a sudden temperature spike caused his compound nervous system to shut down. Insects were efficient, but efficiency became a weakness when conditions exceeded design parameters. Melvin reached his destination as the sun climbed toward its highest point. What he had seen from a distance as empty wasteland was actually something much more valuable. A grove of thornroot trees clustered around what had once been a water source. The trees were ancient, their massive trunks twisted into impossible shapes by centuries of survival in the harshest environment on the planet. Most beings would have seen only danger. The thorns covering every surface were longer than knives, and sharp enough to cut through metal. The wood looked dead, blackened by sun and wind. There was no shelter visible, no shade, no relief from the killing heat. Melvin saw opportunity. Thornroot trees did not grow randomly. They grew where underground water still existed, even if that water was deep and difficult to access. More importantly, their twisted shapes were not accidents of growth. They were adaptations, evolutionary solutions to problems that Melvin recognized. From Earth's most hostile environments, he chose the largest tree, a massive specimen whose trunk was hollow in several places. The hollows were not visible from a distance, hidden by the angle of the thorns and the way shadows fell. It had taken millions of years for the tree to learn how to survive here. Melvin planned to learn from its success. Working carefully to avoid the thorns, he began expanding one of the natural hollows. The wood was incredibly hard, but it could be shaped with patience and the right technique. Each piece he removed was saved. Nothing in a desert was waste. Everything had potential value. The work was hot, exhausting, and dangerous. One mistake would send him to the hospital or the morgue. But Melvin had spent years doing similar work in environments that wanted to kill him. His hands knew how to shape hard materials without power tools. His body knew how to work efficiently in extreme heat. As he worked, he discovered what the tree had learned over the centuries. The hollow trunk created natural air circulation that lowered the internal temperature by almost 15 degrees. The thick walls provided insulation from the worst heat, while still allowing enough airflow to prevent suffocation. Most importantly, the tree's root system extended deep enough to reach groundwater that had been untouchable for thousands of years. By late afternoon, Melvin had created a shelter that would keep him alive through the night. But he was not finished. The wood shavings he had collected could be processed into emergency rations. The inner bark, properly prepared, contained minerals and moisture his body would need. Even the sap, toxic to most species, could be purified using techniques he had learned during survival training in Earth's worst environments. While other candidates struggled against the desert's hostility, Melvin was learning to work with it. The tree had already solved every problem the environment could present. All he had to do was pay attention to its lessons. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, emergency beacons activated across the desert. The temperature differential between day and night on Xerion 7 was more extreme than most species had encountered. Bodies designed for heat suddenly faced cold that could kill just as efficiently. Melvin settled into his hollow tree and began preparing for the next phase of the trial. He had food, water, shelter, and most importantly, understanding. The desert was not his enemy, it was his teacher, and he was a very good student. Outside his sanctuary, the temperature began its plummet toward freezing. The finest survivors from a dozen worlds faced their first night in hell, equipped with evolution's best tools and technology's finest achievements. Inside a hollow tree, a human from Earth prepared for what he knew would be the most comfortable night's sleep of the entire trial. Darkness fell across Xerion 7 like a curtain made of ice. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in less than an hour, transforming the burning wasteland into a frozen hell that killed in different but equally efficient ways. Wind that had been hot enough to blind now carried crystals of frost that cut exposed skin like tiny knives. From his shelter inside the hollow thorn root, Melvin listened to the desert's night voice. The sounds were different now, sharper, more focused, carrying farther in the thin, cold air. Somewhere to the south, he heard the distinct whine of emergency beacons activating as more aliens discovered that their evolutionary advantages had limits. The tree's hollow maintained a steady temperature just above freezing, not comfortable by human standards, but survivable. More importantly, it was predictable. Melvin had learned years ago that surviving extreme conditions was less about comfort and more about managing energy expenditure. Every calorie burned staying. Warm was a calorie not available for tomorrow's challenges. He wrapped himself in strips of processed thornroot bark that he had prepared during the afternoon. The material was not soft, but it trapped air effectively and provided insulation that worked better than most manufactured survival gear. The tree had spent centuries learning how to maintain its core temperature through nights like this. Its lessons were free to anyone smart enough to pay attention. 8 kilometers to the east, the remaining Krillians huddled together in a formation designed to share body heat. Their carapaces, perfect for deflecting heat during the day, now conducted cold directly to their internal organs. 2 of them triggered their emergency beacons before midnight, their cooling systems becoming freezing systems that their biology could not override. The Aquari faced different problems. Their atmospheric suits maintained perfect internal conditions, but the energy cost was enormous. They had designed for efficiency, not endurance. By morning, their power cells would be dangerously depleted, leaving them vulnerable to the day's heat without adequate life support. The Chitani fared better initially. Insects understood cold, and their collective behavior helped distribute heat loads across the surviving members of their group. But they had not accounted for the wind. Xerion 7's night winds carried moisture that froze on contact, creating ice formations that grew heavier with each hour. The extra weight threw off their coordination, and their efficient movements became clumsy struggles against an environment that fought back with increasing violence. Melvin ate sparingly from his supply of processed bark and sap, washing it down, with water he had collected from condensation inside the tree's hollow. The taste was bitter and strange, but his body recognized it as fuel. He had learned to eat what was available, rather than what was pleasant during his years working in remote locations where supply drops failed and emergency rations ran out. As the night deepened, he heard new sounds carrying across the frozen wasteland. The calls of creatures that lived in this desert, things that had adapted to thrive in conditions that killed visitors from other worlds. Most were small, insects and reptiles that burrowed deep during the day and emerged during the cold hours to hunt and feed. One sound was different, larger, more complex, coming from the direction of another thornroot grove about 2 kilometers away. Melvin listened carefully, analyzing the pattern and frequency. Not an animal, definitely not human. One of the surviving aliens, probably injured, possibly dying. The smart choice was to stay put. His shelter was perfect, his supplies adequate, his position strategically sound. Moving through the dark in sub-zero temperatures to help a competitor who would have gladly watched him die was the kind of mistake that eliminated candidates from survival trials. Melvin put on his makeshift outer layers and left the safety of his tree. The desert at night was a different world entirely. The sand that had burned through boot soles during the day now crunched underfoot like broken glass. Stars blazed overhead with an intensity impossible on worlds with thick atmospheres, providing enough light to navigate by once his eyes adjusted. He moved carefully, testing each step before committing his full weight. Frozen sand could hide. Holes, rocks, or patches of different density that would turn an ankle or worse. The sound grew louder as he approached its source. Definitely alien, definitely in distress. He found one of the Chitani trapped in a depression where wind-blown ice had formed a barrier too high and slippery to climb. The creature's compound. Eyes reflected starlight as it looked up at the approaching human. Its translator buzzed weakly. "Come to watch me die, soft skin?" "Come to get you out," Melvin replied, examining the ice formation. It was thicker than it looked, probably reinforced by layers that had built up over several hours. Direct assault would not work, but ice had weaknesses that could be exploited. "Why?" the Chitani asked. "We compete. My death improves your chances." Melvin began chipping away at a specific point in the ice wall, working at an angle that would create structural failure rather than requiring brute force. "Maybe. But dead aliens don't join the defense corps. Live ones might become allies." The work was cold, exhausting, and took nearly an hour. By the time he created an escape route, both of them were operating at the edge of hypothermia. The Chitani climbed out with movements that were clumsy from cold and exhaustion. "I am called Beetle," the alien said, using a translation that probably simplified something more complex. "I owe you debt." "You owe me nothing," Melvin replied. "But if you want to survive until morning, follow me. I know where there's shelter." They made it back to the thornroot grove as the temperature reached its lowest point of the night. Melvin's tree was large enough for 2, barely. The additional body heat actually improved conditions inside the hollow, creating a feedback loop that made survival easier for both of them. Beetle studied the shelter with professional interest. "Clever. You work with environment, not against it." "The tree figured out how to live here millions of years ago," Melvin explained. "Seemed stupid not to learn from it." "My people study survival for generations. We create elaborate theories and complex technologies. You hide in dead wood and eat tree bark. Is it working?" Beetle made a sound that the translator labeled as laughter. "Yes. It works very well. Perhaps my people study wrong things." They shared the shelter through the remaining hours of darkness, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. When dawn finally broke, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, 7 of the original 12 candidates had been eliminated. 5 remained: Melvin, Beetle, 2 Krillians, and 1 Aquari. The second day would bring new challenges, new ways for the desert to test their limits. But Melvin had learned something important during the night. Survival was not about being tougher than the environment. It was about being smarter than your problems. The desert had problems too: heat, cold, wind, drought. But it had also developed solutions over millions of years of trial and error. The thornroot trees were libraries written in bark and wood, containing every lesson the desert had to teach. All anyone had to do was learn how to read them. As the temperature began its climb toward another day of killing heat, Melvin prepared to continue his education. The second day dawned with the promise of death written in every grain of sand. Temperature readings would have shown a 15-degree increase over the previous day, but instruments were unnecessary when the air itself seemed to catch fire. This was Zerion 7 showing its true nature, revealing why the desert had defeated armies and humbled civilizations. Melvin emerged from his thornroot shelter as the first light touched the distant horizon. His body was stiff from sleeping on hard wood, but he was rested and properly hydrated. More importantly, he was learning to read the desert's daily rhythm like a book written in heat and wind. Beetle crawled out after him, compound eyes reflecting the growing light. The Chitani moved with obvious discomfort, his species not designed for the extreme temperature swings. "Human Melvin, why do we not travel during cool morning?" "Because the desert is lying to us," Melvin replied, studying the patterns of wind-blown sand around their grove. "Morning looks safe, but the temperature change is happening too fast. Better to wait and let the environment stabilize." In the distance, the remaining candidates were already moving. The 2 surviving Krillians had learned from their companions' failures and modified their approach. They moved in short bursts, using every piece of available shade to rest and cool their systems. Smart, but still fighting against the desert instead of working with it. The lone Aquari had jettisoned unnecessary equipment during the night, streamlining his suit for maximum efficiency. His movements were more desperate now, driven by the knowledge that his power cells would not last another full day. Speed had become his only chance, even though speed in the desert was usually a form of elaborate suicide. Melvin spent the morning hours doing what others would have considered waste of precious time. He explored the thornroot grove methodically, studying how each tree had adapted to its specific microenvironment. The largest tree, which had provided their shelter, was not the oldest. The twisted ones near the edges were not the weakest. Every variation told a story about water sources, wind patterns, and soil composition. "What do you learn from dead wood?" Beetle asked, watching the human examine trees that had been growing in the same spots for thousands of years. "That it's not dead," Melvin replied, showing the Chitani a section of inner bark that was still green and moist. "These trees are dormant, not dead. They're waiting for the right conditions to become fully active again." He had found something that changed everything about their situation. The thornroot trees were not just individual plants competing for limited resources. They were a network connected by root systems that shared water and nutrients across vast distances. The grove they had sheltered in was actually one organism spread across several square kilometers. More importantly, the network created predictable patterns in the desert's surface features. Water moved through underground channels that followed the root system. Sand accumulated in specific ways that revealed the location of these channels. Even the air temperature varied slightly based on underground water flow. "The desert has roads," Melvin explained to Beetle as they prepared to continue their journey. "Invisible roads that lead from water source to water source. The trees have been building them for millions of years." While other candidates struggled across open sand, fighting the heat and their own biology, Melvin began following the thornroot highway. The path was not obvious to casual observation, marked only by subtle changes in sand texture and plant distribution that required careful attention to detect. But the advantages were enormous. Underground water kept surface temperatures slightly lower along the route. Occasional thornroot groves provided shelter and emergency supplies. Most importantly, the path led directly toward the center extraction point, following the most efficient route possible through terrain that had been mapped by evolution rather than technology. By midday, the Aquari's power systems failed completely. His emergency beacon activated automatically as his suit's life support shut down, saving his life but eliminating him from the trial. One of the Krillians followed an hour later, his modified cooling system overwhelmed by heat that exceeded every projection their scientists had made. The final Krillian, a massive specimen named Thorn, had found his own solution to the desert's challenges. Instead of fighting the heat, he had begun burying himself in sand during the worst temperature periods, using the desert's own mass as insulation. Crude but effective, and showing the kind of adaptive thinking that separated survivors from casualties. Melvin and Beetle made steady progress along their invisible road, stopping frequently to rest in whatever shade they could find and to study the next section of their route. The human shared his knowledge freely, teaching the Chitani to read the signs that revealed underground water and safe passage. "Why do you help me?" Beetle asked during one of their rest stops. "I slow your progress. I consume resources you could keep for yourself." "Because 2 pairs of eyes see things 1 pair misses," Melvin replied, pointing to a rock formation that looked identical to dozens of others they had passed. "You spotted that the rocks there are arranged differently. That difference means something." Beetle's compound eyes were better at detecting small variations in pattern and texture. Combined with Melvin's knowledge of how environments shaped themselves, they made a team that could read the desert's story more completely than either could alone. The rock formation marked a junction in the underground thornroot network, a place where multiple water channels converged deep beneath the sand. Above ground, it created a micro-environment with slightly different air circulation and mineral distribution. To most beings, it was just another pile of red stone in an endless wasteland. To Melvin and Beetle, it was a signpost showing them the fastest route to their destination. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they encountered Thorn digging himself out of his sand shelter. The Krillian's black carapace was scratched and worn, but his vital signs were stable. He studied the approaching pair with obvious suspicion. Human and insect travel together? His translator buzzed. Alliance between competitors? Partnership. Between survivors, Melvin corrected. The desert doesn't care about our politics. It just wants to kill us efficiently. Thorn considered this information while sand continued to fall from his damaged shell. Your survival technique? We follow. The water roads. Water roads do not exist in desert. Melvin pointed to the subtle signs that revealed their path. The way sand grains were distributed, the slight variations in surface hardness, the positions of small plants that grew only where underground moisture was available. Everything exists. We just have to learn to see it. For the next hour, the human taught both aliens to read the desert's hidden language. Thorn learned quickly, his species' natural pattern recognition, adapting to detect signs he had been ignoring for 2 days. Beetle refined his ability to spot minute variations in texture and color that revealed information about subsurface conditions. By evening, 3 very different beings moved across the wasteland as a coordinated team, following roads that had been built by thornroot trees over geological time. They were no longer fighting the desert. They were reading it, understanding it, and using its own adaptations to ensure their survival. Behind them, the extraction point beckoned in the distance, still hours away but no longer impossible to reach. Ahead lay the final night of the trial, when the desert would make its last attempt to claim their lives. But Melvin had learned something important during his years of surviving in places that wanted him dead. The environment was not malicious. It was indifferent. And indifference could be understood, predicted, and ultimately overcome by beings smart enough to pay attention to its lessons. The thornroot trees had been teaching those lessons for millions of years. All anyone had to do was learn how to listen. The final night brought with it a storm that had not appeared in any of the weather predictions. Wind howled across the desert like a living thing, carrying sand that could strip flesh from bone and ice that formed faster than body heat could. Melt it. This was Zerion 7 at its most vicious, showing the 3 surviving candidates why so many before them had died. Melvin, Beetle, and Thok huddled together in a thornroot grove that was larger and older than the others they had encountered. The trees here had grown for so long that their root systems had created underground chambers large enough to shelter entire groups. More importantly, the network was so extensive that it generated its own microclimate, warmer and more stable than the chaos raging outside. "Human Melvin," Thok's translator crackled through the wind noise. "Your species has advantage we do not understand." "What advantage is that?" Melvin asked, working to seal gaps in their shelter with processed bark and sand. "You see patterns that evolution did not design you to see. My carapace protects me from heat, but you taught me to read underground water. Signs that my people never discovered. Beetle's eyes detect variations we cannot perceive, but you showed both of us how to interpret what those variations mean." Beetle's compound eyes reflected the dim light filtering through their shelter. "My people believe efficiency comes from specialization. We develop one ability to perfection and use it to survive. You develop many abilities to adequacy and combine them in ways we never considered." The storm outside intensified, reminding all 3 of them that survival was still uncertain. Temperature readings would have shown conditions that could kill exposed beings in minutes, but their shelter maintained livable conditions through techniques that required no technology beyond careful observation and patient work. "Tell us about your home world," Beetle requested. "What environment created abilities like yours?" Melvin settled back against the smooth inner wall of their refuge. "Earth tried to kill us with everything it had. Ice ages that lasted thousands of years. Droughts that turned forests into deserts. Floods that drowned entire continents. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. Diseases that killed 9 out of every 10 people who caught them." "Your species survived all of this?" Thok asked. "We survived by learning from everything. When the ice came, we learned from the animals that thrived in cold. When the droughts came, we learned from the plants that could store water. When the floods came, we learned from the fish. We never became the best at anything, but we became good enough at everything." Through the shelter's entrance, they could see other emergency beacons activating in the distance. The storm had eliminated 2 more candidates who had been close, enough to reach the extraction point before dawn. Beings who had evolved for specific environments discovered that evolution had limits when conditions exceeded all previous experience. "The thornroot trees teach the same lesson," Melvin continued. "They did not evolve to be the tallest or the strongest or the most efficient. They evolved to be the most adaptable. When the desert changed, they changed with it. When water became scarce, they learned to share it. When temperatures became extreme, they learned to create shelter." He pointed to the walls of their refuge, formed by thornroot wood that was thousands of years old. "This tree is not one organism. It is a community of organisms that learn to work together. The thorns protect the bark. The bark insulates the core. The core channels water to the roots. The roots share resources with other trees. Every part serves the whole, and the whole makes every part stronger." As dawn approached, the storm began to weaken. The 3 survivors prepared for the final phase of their journey, organizing their remaining supplies and planning their approach to the extraction point. They were tired, battered, and operating at the edge of their physical limits. But they were alive when beings far more suited to desert survival had perished. "Human Melvin," Beetle said as they prepared to leave their shelter. "When we reach extraction point, we return to being competitors. Our species will vie for positions in Defense Corps." "Probably," Melvin agreed. "But we learned something here that our governments did not expect us to learn." "What's that?" Thok's translator buzzed with what might have been satisfaction. "That survival is not about being stronger than environment. It is about being smarter than problems." They left the thornroot grove as the sun climbed toward another day of killing heat. But the extraction point was only 4 hours away, following the water roads that evolution had built over millions of years. More importantly, they understood now why the human had succeeded where others had failed. Earth had not given humanity natural armor or efficient metabolisms or specialized organs. Instead, it had given them something more valuable: the ability to learn from everything and adapt to anything. When faced with impossible conditions, humans did not try to overcome the environment through superior evolution. They learned from the environment's own solutions and applied those lessons to their immediate problems. The extraction point appeared in the distance like a mirage made real, a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by landing pads where rescue shuttles waited for survivors who might never come. Monitoring stations tracked their approach, recording data that would be analyzed for years to come. Melvin, Beetle, and Thok reached the perimeter with 3 hours to spare. They were the only candidates still moving under their own power, the only ones who had not needed emergency extraction or medical intervention. Behind them, the desert stretched away like a Red Sea that had tested them with everything it possessed. Director. Cravex materialized from the monitoring station, its liquid form rippling with what might have been surprise. 3 survivors. Unprecedented. Most trials end with 0 candidates reaching extraction. Medical teams swarmed around them, checking vital signs and documenting their condition. Melvin was dehydrated but stable. Beetle showed signs of exhaustion, but no permanent damage. Thok's carapace was scarred and worn, but his internal systems remained functional. Human Melvin, Cravex's attention focused on the plainly dressed man who had outlasted beings specifically evolved for harsh environments. "Our scientist recorded your entire journey. You made choices that defied every survival protocol we understand." "Such as?" Melvin asked, accepting water and nutrition supplements from the medical team. "You spent valuable time helping competitors. You shared resources that could have meant the difference between life and death. You chose longer routes that appeared to offer no advantage, yet you arrived here in better condition than candidates who followed optimal strategies." Melvin looked, back at the desert that had tried to kill him for 36 hours. The optimal strategy was learning from what was already here. The thornroot trees solved every problem this environment could present. They just solved them slowly, over millions of years. You discovered survival techniques that our research teams missed entirely. I discovered that the desert was trying to teach us something. The trees, the water patterns, the temperature cycles, they were all lessons written in a language we had to learn to read. Cravex's form solidified slightly, becoming more focused. Your species passed the trial through methods we never anticipated. But the question remains, what does this mean for the Defense Corps? Beetle stepped forward, his translator crackling. "It means humans bring something we never understood we needed. When environment becomes enemy, most species fight. Humans learn." Thok's massive frame cast shadows across the landing pad. "My people will study human techniques. We will incorporate them into our training programs. And my people will study the thornroot networks," Beetle added. "If such systems exist on other worlds, they could change how we approach hostile environment operations." Director Cravex processed this information with the kind of calculation that came from managing an organization spanning hundreds of worlds. The Defense Corps values specialization. Each species contributes their unique evolutionary advantages to common defense. But specialization has limits, Melvin observed. When you encounter something outside your specialty, you need the ability to adapt. Earth taught humanity to adapt to anything because Earth threw everything at us. You believe human adaptability is more valuable than specialized evolution? I believe they work better together. Beetle's eyes see things I miss. Thok's strength handles challenges I cannot. But when we combine our abilities with adaptive thinking, we become stronger than any of us alone. The medical teams finished their examinations and declared all 3 candidates fit for travel. Rescue shuttles prepared for departure, ready to carry them back to their respective worlds and governments. The trial was officially over. But Kravex had one final question. Human Melvin, if you could change how the Defense Corps approaches hostile environment operations, what would you recommend? Melvin considered the question while looking at the thornroot grove in the distance, its ancient trees still standing guard over secrets that had taken millions of years to perfect. Stop fighting the environment. Start learning from it. Every hostile world has native life that already solved the problems we're trying to overcome. We just have to be smart enough to pay attention to their solutions. And if no native life exists, then we look for the geological solutions, the atmospheric solutions, the chemical solutions. The universe has been solving survival problems for billions of years. We just have to learn how to read the answers. 3 days later, representatives from a dozen species gathered in the Defense Corps headquarters to review the trial results. The footage showed impossible things. A human teaching advanced survival techniques to beings whose entire evolution had been shaped by harsh environments. Aliens learning to read desert languages that their scientists had never detected. Cooperation, emerging between competitors in situations where cooperation should have been fatal. The final vote was unanimous. Humanity would join the Defense Corps not as specialists, but as teachers. Their mission would be to study hostile environments across known space and develop adaptive techniques that could be taught to other species. Earth had spent millions of years trying to kill humanity with ice and fire, flood and drought, disease and disaster. In doing so, it had created the one species capable of learning survival lessons from any environment in the galaxy, the thornroot. Trees had taught them well. Now it was time to share those lessons with the stars. Director Kravex filed the final report with a note that would be studied by xenobiologists for generations. Humans do not survive hostile environments by being stronger than the challenges they face. They survive by being smarter than the problems they encounter. This distinction may be the most important discovery in Defense Corps history. In the end, the desert trial had not been about surviving 36 hours in impossible conditions. It had been about learning to read the language that life itself used to overcome the impossible. Humanity had passed not because they were tougher than other species, but because Earth had taught them to listen when the universe offered to share its secrets. The thornroot trees continued growing in their desert, adding new rings each year, their networks spreading deeper and wider as they learned new ways to thrive in a world that wanted them dead. They had been excellent teachers. They had taught humanity well.